Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Paula Price and I will be your host today. We are talking about leadership for women lawyers. And I'm so thrilled to have you here. Thank you for joining me for this lunch and learn. Or if you're on a different time zone, maybe it's an afternoon break. So what are we doing here today? I would love to share with you our agenda. We're going to spend a few minutes just making introductions, talking about the plan for the hour. We're then going to talk a little bit more about leadership opportunities in your practice. We're going to talk about some of the common blocks to leadership, and then we're going to dive into 3 leadership strategies that you can use right away in your practice. We'll have a few minutes after that for takeaway and questions. And what I would love is for you to participate during today's webinar. And there are a couple ways that you can do that. One way to do that is by using the chat function. So right now I've got my chat box open. You may have yours open. So if you have any messages that you'd like to share with me or with the group, by all means, use the chat. There's also a Q&A box, and you're welcome to put your questions into the Q&A. You can submit them anonymously. Nobody will be able to see your questions except for me. So feel free to use that as well to communicate. I would love to hear from you. If I see that there are questions as we're going through the material, then I will try to answer them as we go. And there will be time at the end for questions as well. Now, are you in the right place? I think you're in the right place. If you have any questions about that, here are some indications that this is a webinar that will be of relevance and useful for you. You are a woman in practice. Now, you may not be a woman in practice, you may be a man in practice, and you're welcome as well. The material will be more tailored to women lawyers. And chances are you're a few years into practice. For those of you who are relatively early in your years, that's great. You're here. This will give you some insights into looking ahead. There may be areas in your practice where already you're starting to feel like you're stepping into leadership. And for others, it may be that you're at a senior associate level, you're junior partner, or maybe you've been in leadership for quite some time. And what you're doing here is really focusing on enhancing your leadership by spending some time really thinking about what leadership means to you, what it means in your practice. Now, it may be for some of you, you are trying to support other women, right? You may be fairly far along in terms of the leadership and you're figuring out how you can support other women who are junior to you. It may be that you are transitioning into a role or you're at a crossroads in your career where you want to grow, you want to move into leadership, and you're thinking about whether or not where you are is the right place for you to do that, or whether a different path might be better for you. You may be looking to establish your own practice. And so the leadership would then be leading yourself, potentially leading a team as you do that. It may be that you're also feeling a little bit reactive in your practice. And what you want in terms of leadership is more control over how it is that you're spending your days and your weeks. So that can also be a component of leadership. And finally, for many of you who are joining me here today, who are joining us here today, you may have the little people at home, the mothers who have children who are maybe those really early years where they're little tiny babies and you're kind of in those stages, figuring out how to practice while being a parent. And for some of you, you'll have had your children a few years ago and you're figuring out how to balance both, right? How to balance your career goals and aspirations along with the goals and aspirations that you have for your family. And so that can put a lot of pressure in terms of figuring out what leadership looks like in both of those spheres. So we're going to start out then by, and I should also mention a little bit about me. So for some of you, you are already familiar with me and some of the work that I do with lawyers. I mentioned at the beginning, my name is Paula Price. I used to practice law for many years. I was a litigator in private practice. I think I spent about 12 years altogether in private practice, most of it at a national law firm. And had 2 children while I was practicing law. And at a certain point in my career, I became absolutely fascinated by coaching. It was serendipitous. I just kind of discovered it and became kind of obsessed with it, and it led me to the work that I do now. What I love to do is provide the resource for lawyers that I wish that I had had when I was in practice. I spend a lot of my time working with lawyers, helping them to set their goals, achieve their goals, deal with challenges that they're having in their practice. Coaching for me is a space that is, it's not counseling per se, where you're looking at some of the more complex emotional challenges that you can have. It's not so much mentoring where you're looking at somebody and asking them, how did you do it? Can you tell me what to do? It's something different where you're partnering, you're supporting, and you're looking at the possibilities that are out there and how to achieve them. I work with lawyers in one of three ways. I either do one-to-one coaching, I do group coaching, and I'll talk a little bit more about how you can work with me in that capacity at the end of today's webinar. And then I also do speaking for law firms and other organizations on various topics like time management, like leadership, like confidence. And I have a podcast called The Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, where I talk about all of these things. You may have learned of me through the podcast. If you haven't tuned into the podcast, then I invite you to check it out. There's a lot in there, and it's all based on experience that I have had with lawyers in my practice. So I'm kind of shifting the slides on you a little bit. Wanted to introduce myself as well. And now we are diving into the substance. So I mentioned we're going to talk about leadership opportunities in your practice. We're going to talk about some common obstacles, and we're going to talk about 3 strategies that you can use in your practice to enhance your leadership right away. So first of all, thinking about leadership opportunities, I thought it would be helpful to start with a definition of leadership. And I looked online for a definition that I thought was suitable, and this is the best one that I came across. Leadership is about helping others reach their potential while also ensuring that the team achieves its goals. Leaders elevate others to achieve a common goal. So, what I love about this definition is that it talks about reaching potential, right? As a leader, you're looking to others and you're helping them to reach their potential while also ensuring that you're achieving the goal of the team. Leaders elevate others. So there's this idea of elevation. And I love this definition because it encapsulates the way that I like to see leadership. Another way to read this definition is to look at it as how you would apply that as leading yourself, right? Helping yourself to reach your own potential while also ensuring that you are achieving your goals. When it comes to leadership in your practice, I think one of the most helpful things we can do is to simply raise our awareness of where the opportunities are for leadership. This is why I'm so glad you're joining me here today, because it's an opportunity for you to be thinking about your own practice and where the opportunities for leadership are. Now, before we dive in, I would invite you to each ask yourselves, on a scale of 1 to 10, where you rank yourself in terms of leadership. And write the number down, the first number that comes to mind. And the idea here is that we just want to gain awareness, right? How do you see yourself as a leader? And we're going to dive into how that looks in your practice. And then you can also ask yourself how that will look as you develop your leadership skills. So for now, we just need to put a score on a scale of 1 to 10. Where would you rank yourself currently? Now, there are a number of areas within your practice. And as I go through these, again, please think about your own practice. And if you like, jot some notes down in terms of what those opportunities might be. Now, when it comes to leadership, it all begins with leading yourself. And there are a number of components to that. The first being self-awareness. This is actually one of your executive functioning skills, this idea of metacognition. And what it means is that you're able to step outside of yourself and see yourself from an observer's perspective. So if you were to be watching yourself throughout the day, for example, how do you see yourself as a leader? Or perhaps how are you not seeing yourself as a leader? Leading yourself also ties into your self-concept. How do you see yourself? Now, your self-concept is often formed by the labels that we attach to ourselves that are given to us and that we adopt unconsciously, some that we choose consciously. So for each of you, chances are you're wearing the label of daughter. You may be a sister, you may be a mother, a friend, and you are a lawyer, right? These are all labels that we wear that go to the core of our identity. And so when it comes to leadership, what I'd invite you to think about is how you identify yourself at a self-concept level as a leader. What does that look like for you? Another way of leading yourself is in terms of the way that you speak to yourself. When you have that internal dialogue, and we all do, if there's a voice inside your head that's talking to you throughout the day, you're normal. We all have that. And the tone of that is, in effect, how you are leading yourself. So, what language are you using when it comes to that internal dialogue? What messaging are you giving yourself throughout the day? Strategic motivation. How do you motivate yourself to do things? Are you motivated by fear and stress? Are you motivated by passion? Are you motivated by commitment? There is something that is pulling you at all times to be moving forward. What is that for you? How are you leading yourself through your tasks? Discipline. So, discipline to me is following through on the promises you make to yourself. How are you doing? And then finally, confidence, the confidence you have as within yourself as a leader, leading yourself. That's that ability to inspire trust. And it begins with self-trust. And you might ask yourself how that relationship is with yourself. Are you being honest with yourself about your dreams, your desires, and what you're doing to achieve those things? Now, the next level of leadership in your practice is this idea of team. So we move beyond yourself into the team of lawyers, assistants, staff who are working with you. And so that begins at a fairly, at the level and I've got a number of different layers, training. If you have people who are on your team, you need to train them. So as a leader, you're showing them what it is that you need them to do for you. Delegating is another area in which you're leading your team. So you are shifting the responsibility to execute tasks, parts of files to somebody else. It means that you need to let go of that work and not do it yourself, which can be really difficult, especially when we are A-type. We want things done a certain way, and we've got to get somebody else to do that for us. There can be guilt associated with that. We feel like we should be the ones who are doing that thing. And sometimes there's also a reluctance because we don't want to be seen as an authoritarian. I've had this discussion with more than one of the clients that I've worked with where there can be a hesitancy to delegate to others or to be really clear or firm with expectations because we don't want to be seen as authoritarian, right? As telling them what to do in a way that we don't necessarily align with. Other aspects of leading your team, feedback, right? When the work comes back and the work is done perfectly, it's easy to give feedback. I like how you did this. This was structured well. Everything was on time. Great. But what about when the work that comes back isn't to the standard that you need it to be? What happens when expectations aren't met? How are you giving feedback in those moments? Sometimes there can be a fear that if you deliver difficult feedback, that you're going to lose that person, that you're going to hurt their feelings. So there are a number of challenges that come into play when it comes to leading others. And these are some of the elements that you'll be thinking about when you are imagining the leadership role you play in your practice. Mentoring, so taking on others and nurturing them in a way that is beyond your basic job description, right? This goes beyond the assigning work and giving some feedback. Mentoring, right? How are you helping others build themselves? Fostering connection and cohesion among your team. So not only are you looking at the relationship you have with the individuals that you work with, but also how are they working with each other? And then finally, modeling. When I think of how you lead in your practice, what kind of conduct are you modeling for others? When things don't go according to plan, how do you deal with that? How do you demonstrate that to others? So then we move to the next layer, which is leadership on an organizational level. And for some of you, you may already have a seat at the table, or you may be very close to having a seat at the table. So the level of influence that you exert within your organization. So what are some of the examples there? Well, leading may be implementing some of what has already been decided at the organizational level, right? People are getting their work done, you're following certain systems and policies. This could also include shaping the vision or the direction of the organization. It may mean making your voice heard. So, a number of lawyers that I have worked with who have a seat at the table don't feel like their voice is being heard at the table. Sometimes there's a conflict in terms of values, or you may want to innovate in a way that isn't currently being done. There may be opportunities that you would like to create or pursue. Sometimes there are difficult conversations around compensation. So, you may, again, be leading within your organization, and there's opportunities here for your leadership. You may also be looking at that next layer, which is influencing policy, how things are done within your organization, and then finally, influencing culture. What influence can you have in terms of the overall organization? So finally, moving beyond the space in which you work, there's the broader community. And right now, I love to think that we are all here at today's webinar, joining from different communities. We are in ourselves forming a community, a virtual one. And here, the question is, what role do you want to play in that larger arena? And some roles might be a builder. You may be somebody who is fostering connection or building some sort of a program. You may be an influencer, somebody who's fostering change within the legal profession or within your area of practice. You may be a contributor, somebody who is out there educating, who is raising awareness, who is supporting others. And finally, you may be an innovator in the sense of really transforming the way that we're practicing law. So there are all these different ways in which you may be leading within your practice. And what I would invite you to do today is to think about those different opportunities and to note those opportunities for yourself so that you can go and pursue them after we wrap up today. So I wanted to share with you some of the common blocks that I see in my practice when it comes to leadership. And again, I've really thought about the women lawyers that I have been working with and what can sometimes hold them back. So I'm going to start with the practical limits, move into social factors, and then finally internal barriers. So the practical limits, these are some of the you might think of them as external barriers to leadership for women. And as I say it, I realize there is a huge conversation about equality and equity and opportunities for women. And that is probably beyond the scope of this webinar. So I'm really focusing quite tactically on some of the limits and speaking about them in a more general way. So for example, there may be institutional blocks that are preventing you from moving forward in your organization. So what does that look like? They simply might not exist, right? The way that you may be in a law firm, you may be in government, you may be in-house. So you may find that there are caps on where you can go simply because of the structure, right? The way that your group may be structured, the openings that will exist in the future within your organization. Maybe there's a certain lockstepness that you need to follow. So there can be limits simply based on the structure of where you are. Sometimes it's the makeup of the group itself. And so you just don't see how within a container, within the personalities that are there, how you're going to move ahead, how you can take on leadership. Sometimes there are firm policies that may require certain things in order to step into a leadership position. And those are things that you do not have, that you will not be able to meet, right? There may be certain billing targets, for example, that are not going to be compatible with your overall picture of life, right? And I'm thinking in particular of women who have children at home who sometimes are not able to have the time literally to meet certain targets. And so that might functionally create a barrier in terms of what leadership opportunities will be available to you where you are currently. Now, sometimes other practical limits are a lack of support within your organization. So it may be that you don't have the mentorship that you need, you don't have the sponsorship that you need in order to advance. Sometimes you lack the assistance that you need. So here, the firm itself may not have the resources. There may not be the junior lawyers. There may not be the staff that is required to support you in doing or advancing in your work. You might want to move on to these different opportunities, take on a more leadership role in your files, but there's nobody there beneath you to whom you can delegate your work. And this isn't just a woman lawyer thing. This is lawyers that I've spoken with across the board. This can be a problem. Sometimes lack of support outside of work. And so you may simply find that there are some challenges within the way that your life is set up that make it difficult, right? Sometimes it's community, right? You feel like maybe you're just not supported. You don't have the foundation in place to feel like leadership is something that is viable for you. You may find that your commitments at home, you need a bit of help there to support you. And then sometimes the lack of support comes from a reluctance to even ask for help, right? You might feel like you should be able to do all of these things. And so sometimes you might shy away from seeking out the support that you may potentially have. Now, another practical limit that I would include, and I've alluded to it already, is when you have the role of mother along with your role as lawyer. And I've worked with a number of women who have families, and there is a full range across the spectrum in terms of what that looks like for professional work and non-professional work. For some lawyers, they have structures in place to care for the children that allow them to spend more time at work. And for others, they have less of those infrastructures in place and they spend less time at work. And so the pace at which you decide to move ahead within your practice will vary depending on what you choose. And it's a choice for everybody. Everybody has a different definition of what they want their life to look like. And so there's no right or wrong, there is just different. But when it comes to leadership, sometimes what that can mean is that sometimes lawyers will slow down their advancement into leadership because they're trying to spend more time with their kids at a certain stage. Sometimes they think they want to do that, and then they realize that actually leadership is more viable than they thought in terms of the time commitment. They don't actually need to put that on hold. Sometimes they do put leadership on hold or projects they want to innovate on hold to accommodate. So that can be something that will impact or affect the speed at which you move into more of a leadership role. Other blocks, the second, I call them social factors. And what this alludes to is just some of the maybe unconscious or environmental influences that may prevent women from fully embracing leadership. And so some of those are cultural, right? You may find that within your organization, there is a lack of role models who are like you. It may be a lack of women who are in leadership positions. It may be that there are women, but the values or the lifestyle or the nature of leadership doesn't necessarily align with your set of values. Sometimes it's the culture of the organization itself doesn't really align with what you want in your practice. Sometimes the cultural influences might be more socialization. And so you have probably heard that debate or that discussion of women as more caregiver types. Is this something that is innate? Is this something that is learned or socialized for women? And what that can mean is that sometimes within an organization, women may take on a disproportionate share of roles that are really incredible roles, right? They serve a very useful purpose within the organization, but it may not be recognized or promoted or compensated in a way that that supports it or that is aligned with an increase in leadership status within the organization. So what that might look like, sometimes it's mentoring, and I am 100% in favor of mentoring, but I have noticed that sometimes women may take on a disproportionate amount of mentoring that then has a negative effect on their ability to take on other types of work and also compromises their balance. And I, again, understand balance is a bit of a weighted concept, but you may find that you're asked to mentor more. And this is not to say that you should not do it, but just let's notice that this is something that may affect women more than men, for example. Sometimes it can be committee work or non-billable projects or the type of files that you are given or that you're invited to work on. And so these are just areas to be mindful that these are sometimes different for women in practice versus men in practice. And there's also this educational influence. And I recently did a podcast about leadership mindset, and I drew a distinction between a student mindset and a leadership mindset. And this is really based on the idea that a lot of what we're taught as students is not necessarily, I mean, these are wonderful skills to have, but they're not necessarily skills that will advance you as a leader. So, for example, being a good student, trying to get those good grades, seeking out external validation, looking for the correct answer, deferring to authority, looking for the path, having a perfectionist mindset versus a growth mindset. There's a whole podcast episode on this, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. But the way that we've learned as students in school, in a classroom environment, those skills are great for writing exams and learning materials and thinking, but they're not necessarily the same skills that are going to help you advance professionally. And then finally, I have trusting the system, right? This idea that if you work hard, you will be rewarded. And that sometimes is 100% the case, and sometimes it isn't. And so the idea here is just to be looking at what some of the barriers are and to be aware of them. These may not apply to you, some of them may resonate with you. The idea here is really just to raise awareness. And then finally, internal barriers. And this is where there's quite a bit of leverage, right? In terms of the work that I do with lawyers, this is where we have a lot of leverage in terms of our thinking. So for some lawyers, leadership is something that you feel like you need to wait for, right? You need to wait for having a title before you can take on that leadership role. You need to wait for permission or encouragement, an invitation. Some of you are waiting for validation that your idea that you want to go ahead with is good enough, or you may be waiting for the right time. This happens quite a bit, and it's a tricky question. What is the right time for you to make that transition into leadership, or maybe into a new environment where you can have that role, that leadership role, or the path to leadership that you want? Sometimes you're waiting for the answer, right? You want to know for certain that this thing that you want to do will work out. Sometimes you're waiting to feel ready, which will unfortunately keep many of us waiting for quite some time. And then you may feel, or you may be waiting to feel like you want to do it, right? And again, kind of like waiting to feel like you're ready. You may never truly want to do it, right? It might be something that you know you want to do it, but it's potentially going to be really difficult. And so waiting for it to feel good might leave you waiting indefinitely. Another internal block, and this again is one that I see a lot in my practice, is self-confidence. And so it's like you know that you've got the capacity and the potential, you've got a vision of what leadership can look like for you, and yet you struggle to take the steps, right? Because you may feel that imposter syndrome, you may feel that sense of self-doubt, which I will offer is the natural feeling anytime you do something new that is beyond your current comfort zone. There's that feeling of self-doubt, self-sabotage. There's discomfort sometimes in being seen, especially when you're stepping out in front of a crowd to do something that is different. And for some of you, you may associate this idea of being confident as being arrogant. And there's quite a bit that happens in socialization too, right? Where we want to be humble, we want to not be braggy. And so where do you draw the line between being humble and being braggy? And in the middle is confidence, right? We want to inspire the trust of others, and we want to feel good moving forward with our ideas. So we've talked about some of the opportunities that may already be there in your practice, right? Opportunities to lead yourself, your team, your organization within the broader legal community. We've talked about some of the barriers, some of the institutional or external barriers that may be at play, some of the socialization, the cultural challenges that we need to overcome. And then we've talked about some of the internal barriers, right? The confidence, the waiting for the time to feel right. And so what I wanted to offer to you today were strategies that you could use right away, right? These aren't necessarily strategies that you have to wait to use. They apply because they are fundamental shifts that you can do without having to have something else in play. And so I'll explain what that means as we go through them. The first strategy is to lead yourself first. The second strategy is to choose to be outstanding. And the third strategy is to exert your influence. Now, before we talk about the strategies, I want to share with you this change cycle model. It was developed by Martha Beck. She is a well-known life coach. She wrote a book, Finding Your Own North Star. That's where this graph comes from. I refer to it quite a bit when I'm helping lawyers with transitions. And in effect, if you're looking at leadership as a transition that you want to make, it is going to be potentially difficult, right? If you don't see yourself as a leader currently and you want to become a leader, there's a change that needs to take place. Now, if we go back to the beginning of today's webinar, you might think about where it is that you first ranked yourself, what number you gave yourself. So let's say you gave yourself a 6 on a leadership scale. What I would invite you to think about is, where would you like to be on that spectrum? If 10 is the top and you're at a 6, where would you like to be? Now, let's say you decided you'd like to be at an 8. You'd like to go from a 6 from an 8. Then the question that I would ask you is, what would be different for you, right? If you were to go from a 6 to an 8, what would that look like? How would you be leading yourself? How would you lead your team? What would you be building? And how would you be delivering feedback? Let's say something came back to you and it wasn't exactly what you'd had in mind. How would you deal with that situation? What role would you play within your organization? And then finally, what impact would you make overall in the legal profession? So I'd love for you to have that in your mind's eye, right? There's this idea of you further along the journey as a leader, what you are doing, what you're accomplishing, what it looks like over there. And then I'd ask you to consider what the cost is of not leading, right? Nobody says that you have to be a leader, right? It's not something you absolutely need to do. You can choose not to, but you're here and you're thinking about it. So let's say you do decide you want to take that journey. Um, what would be the cost of waiting, right? If nothing changed, what would it look like a year from now, or 3 years from now, or 5 years from now? And we're going through this at a fairly swift speed. These are questions you might want to think about and spend a little bit more time on outside of this webinar. But thinking into the future is a really great way of assessing whether you're on the right track. So imagine then that you do step into that leadership role. Imagine that you go from the 6 to the 8, the 6 to the 10. Again, what is different for you in 1 year, in 3 years, in 5 years? So again, going back to these shifts, and we're going to talk about them, leading yourself first, choosing to be outstanding, exerting your influence. Those are some of the areas where we can shift into that next layer or that next level of leadership for you. And the reason I put this change cycle up, sorry, I realized I was talking for quite some time without addressing the change cycle. This change cycle acknowledges and gives you a framework for thinking about the discomfort that you will very likely experience if you're moving from a 6 to an 8, if you're moving from a 4 to a 7, if you're moving from an 8 to a 10, right? If you're moving forward somewhere you haven't been yet, it is going to require a number of things from you. Now, the change cycle, it's these 4 squares. Square 1, death and rebirth. Square 2, dreaming and scheming. Square 3, the hero saga. Square 4, the promised land. And you can imagine that you're going along in your life and something happens, and you'll see the little circle, catalytic event. This is when something comes along and it changes the way that you're experiencing your life. Now, we're thinking about your practice. This catalytic event often is, a decision to start a new job. Here, it might be that the catalytic event is partnership, right? We can all identify what that looks like. It might be something happens in your personal life, right? You decide to move cities. So the catalytic event is the instigator for the cycle, the change cycle. So here, let's say that the catalytic event is that you decide that you want to be a leader, right? You want to jump up from a 6 to an 8. So what happens there is that immediately it's going to be uncomfortable, right? This is the death and rebirth, because what happens is there is a death, right? The part of you that was comfortable at being a 6 has got to go. And what we're going to be introducing, the rebirth, is that part of you that is now choosing to operate at that higher level. So it's difficult, right? You can imagine if you're in a job transition, for example. Let's say that for whatever reason you are leaving one job and going to another, often there's that really shaky period, that death and rebirth. Let's say you start your own firm, right? You decide you want to start your own firm, you throw yourself into square one, right? You're saying goodbye to the comfort of being within another organization, you're starting your own. That is a really difficult square to be in. Saying goodbye, entering new. That's when you move into square two, dreaming and scheming. So you've decided you want to be a leader, then you're dreaming and scheming. You're thinking about all the ways in which you can do that. And then you move into square three, where you start testing all of these ideas. And what you'll find is that some of your ideas are going to work and some of them are not going to work. And ultimately, you end up in square four, the promised land, right? Where you reach your goal, you reach your 8, whatever that happens to be. So I'm introducing this idea because sometimes I think we look at a goal and we imagine how great it's going to be. And what we don't account for is that the process to get there is going to have challenges in it. And so when we're not anticipating it to be a smooth ride, when we're anticipating what the changes can look like, and we have something like this, a model that we can refer back to, we can anticipate that there will be challenges and we know we're going to get through them. So moving into the strategies, the first one here is to lead yourself first. Now, one of the challenges that I've noticed with lawyers who are at all levels of practice, this is junior level, senior level, really senior level, is that sometimes we are so used to leading ourselves in a way that is that creates stress, right? There's this negative internal dialogue. I should be further along. I should have known better. I always get things wrong. There's all of these different ways that we are talking to ourselves, thinking that we're motivating ourselves, right? We think that by beating ourselves up and speaking harshly to ourselves, that we're going to end up driving ourselves to success. And to some extent, that has worked, right? It may have worked in the past. And so you're relying on that because you want it to continue to work. It may simply be that you're used to it, right? You're used to having stress be a motivator, having pressure be a motivator. And it may be that that was what was modeled to you, right? On the cinema, we've seen movies where people are, stressed and then they succeed, or maybe there are family members who were like that, or lawyers at your firm who are like that. And so you see that. But the problem is that when we operate from this place of this really harsh internal dialogue, right? Again, these statements that it's all or nothing thinking, right? It's very black and white. It's should. Anything that starts with a should is really a could plus shame, right? Labels. We sometimes will label ourselves as a procrastinator or not a leader. Mind reading is another thing that we might do, right? We make assumptions that somebody is thinking something about us and we have no foundation for that. Or we catastrophize, right? We make a typo on an email and then we catastrophize that we're going to get fired or we're going to lose the case, whatever it happens to be. So we want to start paying attention as a leader, right? As a leader leading herself, we want to notice how it is that you are speaking to yourself. When we operate from that place of stress, that negative internal self-talk, is that it can have the effect of blocking creativity. Stress is really great to get us through challenges and for us to really mobilize our energy, but it's not a long-term sustainable way to get things done. It can lead to burnout. And so what we want to do is to gain awareness of how we're leading ourselves and lead ourselves in a more productive and positive way. And you'll notice this quote on the slide. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. And this is Carl Rogers. He was an American psychologist. But I love this quote because it really illustrates the idea of accepting where you are currently versus where you wish that you were, making peace and moving forward from there. So this is the shift, right? As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm trying to offer you some strategies that you can adopt right away. And this will take practice, especially if you're used to having a negative internal dialogue. But the shift here is accepting where you are and then allowing that for moving forward. Now, what you will then do, right? So you notice the internal dialogue and then you want to replace that with something else. So some language that might be helpful for you is to notice, well, first of all, make a decision to refuse to speak to yourself that way, right? Set a boundary with yourself. I'm not going to use should statements on myself anymore. Instead, we're going to identify sentences that we can say that are more helpful. So ones that I particularly like, I wonder what happened there, right? If you find yourself with a typo, for example, I wonder what happened there. Now, it might sound a little weird as I'm saying it now, but instead of jumping into judgment, oh, you shouldn't have done that. You obviously rushed through that. You were careless, whatever. Instead, I wonder what happened there. Oh, well, it makes sense that it makes sense. Another one of my favorites. It makes sense that I would make a typo. I've got 5 different windows open on my computer. So the phone was ringing. There was pressure for me to get this email out the door right away. And my assistant walked into my office just as I was hitting send. So, I mean, there may be a lot of reasons, right? And so just noticing why these things are happening, it makes sense that I would feel pressure writing this argument because there's a lot at stake here. And so it makes sense that I would want to put it off, right? Until a point that I feel ready, it makes sense. Another way that you might speak to yourself is just thinking about how to break things down and make it easier on yourself. So let's start with one thing, right? I just need to write a first draft. So the idea here is just to raise awareness about how you're speaking to yourself and then find better ways to speak to yourself that are meeting you where you are. Now, the fascinating thing here too is that when you start being really aware of that internal dialogue, it also has an impact on how you are toward others. Because the way that you treat yourself, the way that you lead yourself will reflect onto others. And I've worked with lawyers where they have had challenges with other lawyers, in particular, the way that they're delegating, the expectations they have of others. And what's so interesting is that it's them projecting their expectations of themselves onto others. And so when you start to manage your expectations and lead yourself with more kindness, you may find that has a flow-on effect to those that you are working with. And finally, the last note here is that having that kindness in your internal dialogue, it will help you, especially if you decide to put yourself on a leadership path, right? You are choosing growth. And so you more than ever want to be able to have a relationship with yourself where you feel like you're being led with that kindness. So that is shift number 1. So we're going to accept where you are, we're going to make peace, and we're going to move forward. And the way we're going to do that is with our internal dialogue. Now, the second area here, the second shift, is choose to be outstanding. When you decide that what you want is to lead, you are by definition going to stand out. And so we want to be prepared for that. Outstanding means standing out, marked by eminence and distinction, right? The idea here is we don't want to fit in and conform, right? We had talked about how as students, right, the more you can conform, the better you fit the mold, the more, the higher the letter grade. But here we're going to start looking for opportunities to stand out, opportunities to step forward. If you think about what leadership means, leadership is going first, right? It's being in plain sight. It's not being like everybody else. And that's part of what makes being a leader, on the one hand, really exciting and at the same time kind of terrifying, right? You're putting yourself out there. So I would invite each of you to think about opportunities where you are, right? Where you can stand out, you can take that step. And here, I'm not suggesting that anybody be reckless and step out into traffic when there's cars going in both directions, but to be aware of the opportunities where you can distinguish yourself. So think about the first time, for example, if you're a litigator, the first time that you went to court and what that felt like. Maybe it's the first time that you disagreed with your boss, or you spoke up in a meeting, or you led your first transaction, or maybe it's saying no to something, right? So there's examples where you would have been the first, right? And there's that feeling of exposure, right? For some of the lawyers that I've worked with, they really feel this when they're on social media, right? They're trying to build their practice, they're developing a presence online. You may feel very exposed, having all those eyes on you. You're in the spotlight, you may feel that sense of responsibility. You may also feel like you're really open to criticism at that point, right? You're out there, you're doing something different, and it can be very uncomfortable. Um, there's a notion of having a set point. This is a concept that was developed by Gay Hendricks, who wrote The Big Leap. This idea that we all have an internal thermostat where we're comfortable, right? So you might be comfortable at a level 6 leadership. And when you go to a level 8, you start to feel uncomfortable because you've moved past your set point. And so what we're doing here is we're embracing, right? We're, instead of letting that set point be something that then pulls us back, right? We might get to the 8 and we feel so uncomfortable that we engage in some sort of a self-sabotage behavior to go back to a 6. You might think of the example of a lottery winner, somebody who is maybe poor and then they win millions of dollars in the lottery and then they spend it all the next day because it feels so uncomfortable. They want to go back to where they were. Same can be true of your growth and development, right? You think it's going to feel good, but it's actually kind of uncomfortable because it's beyond what you're used to. So that's why we want to choose to be outstanding. So we're going to look for opportunities to stand out. And what we're also going to do is we're going to be willing to feel the discomfort of distinction. So what does that mean? Well, if you're going to move beyond your comfort zone, that means that there are going to be these feelings, right? This discomfort, and the shift is to be okay with that. There's another really great book that I love on this topic. That it's a book by Tara Moore. It's called Playing Big, and she talks about really stepping up as a leader. She talks about this student mentality and moving into this bigger role. So if that's something that is of interest to you, I recommend that as well. So here, we're not going to be shrinking. We have a willingness to be judged, a willingness to go first, a willingness to play big. So that's the second shift. And then the third shift that we're going to talk about today is exerting your influence. So here, and this ties back a bit to this idea of waiting, right? That we're waiting for the perfect moment for us to act. And when we wait, we can end up waiting a really long time. And what I've noticed is that for a lot of lawyers that I've worked with, there's a reluctance to ask other people to do things because we don't want to be seen as imposing on them. So here, the invitation is to start exerting your influence more. The problem that happens is if we're not asking for help, we're not asking for people to do things, we're not delegating, then we can end up in this situation where there's a bottleneck, right? At work, you might think about the work that you're not able to delegate. You hit a bit of a wall, right? Things are not getting done. You aren't building a team. If you're not building a team, you can't really be leading your team. You don't get a chance to develop the skills to lead, right? Because you're busy doing the work that you've already done. You know how to do it. Instead of delegating that and moving on to the next task, you might find that you hit a plateau, right? Your hours are limited. You can only do so many things. So you are wanting to continue to increase the level of skill, and that means you're going to have to start pushing your work down. So exerting your influence is asking you to do that. And this can be challenging because sometimes we feel like we don't want to ask other people to do that because it would come at an expense to them. It might inconvenience them. You don't want to be seen as authoritarian, etc. And so here the idea is to have a shift in terms of the way that you're thinking about this. So number one is you want to identify some of the bottlenecks that you have right now. They might be in your practice, they may be at home, right? There may be home responsibilities that you may want to delegate in order to free up your time to develop that next level of skill. And this means exerting your influence to ask for what you need, right? It means volunteering your ideas. It means building connections. And the shift here is to start looking at your role, not so much as you being the one to delegate to so-and-so, right? I would invite you to think about this more from the perspective of here is the goal. And in order to reach that goal, a number of things need to happen. And my job is to make those things happen. So the vision of the goal is what will inspire the action. And I have this quote, a rising tide lifts all boats, because by involving others, we are not inconveniencing them. We are not ruining their weekends. I'm thinking of assigning work to junior lawyers, for example. We're actually all coming along together. Let's go back to that initial definition on that earlier slide. Leaders elevate others to achieve a common goal. So here you might think about how you are exerting your influence within your practice, your organization. And what does that look like? You're building your team, you're delegating to your assistant, to your lawyers, you're asking for what you need, you're setting expectations, you're providing feedback, you're giving that mentorship, you're asking for the support that you need, right? Sometimes I see lawyers who are working really hard to develop their team and they're not getting the cooperation, the buy-in that they need, and they think it's all on their shoulders, but there's other people who can support you. Who else in a position of authority can you turn to? Is there an HR department that you can turn to? It may be sharing your sharing your input regarding the direction of the organization. People may not see what it is that you see. It may mean seeking out mentors and seeking out sponsors, right? You have a vision of where you want things to go. Who can you find that can help you achieve that vision? It means taking your seat at the table, right? If somebody's not giving you that seat or they're not listening to your voice, how can you make yourself heard? And then finally, it's building community, right? How can you exert your influence to build a community of professionals, inside and outside of work too, that supports you, but also that support each other, that bring you closer to that vision. So what happens here then, the shift is rather than focusing on yourself and how you may be nervous about doing something, the shift then goes to why is this really important? You're tying your actions to a broader goal, and that helps pull you forward, right? Exerting your influence is easier, it's more palatable when you see it as serving the greater good. So those are the shifts and the ideas. So just to summarize, we've talked about the opportunities to lead. So that was leading yourself, your team, your organization, and within the community. We've talked about blocks to leadership. So some of those practical blocks, some of the cultural and internal blocks that you might face. And then we've talked about those 3 shifts to make, right? Being kind in leading yourself, the way that you talk to yourself. We've talked about being outstanding, willing to step in front of wherever it is you are. There's that exposure and there's also that opportunity to then lead. And we've talked about influencing others. And when you make these shifts, the impact is profound, right? These are, and you might think about setting your GPS on a journey. And if you were to dial it over by 1 degree, for example, over time, that adds up. So here, these are shifts you can start doing. And if you continue to apply them, you can ask yourself, what is going to look different for you 1 year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? Now, I don't see any questions yet. And so you're welcome to share your questions with me. What I would love is just to share some information about a program that I'm offering that I am very excited about. It is a group coaching and mastermind program. I have been running a program that is very similar to this for the past 1.5 years, and it's a program for women lawyers, and it's a way of bringing together a community of like-minded women lawyers, all of whom are focused on a goal in their practice. The next group will begin in July and will go from July to December 2024. The group is capped at 8 women. I chose 8 because I think we all fit very nicely on a Zoom screen. The meetings are held using a Zoom meeting function, so it's different from a webinar, which is what we're doing today. During the meetings, we can all see each other. And the idea there is also to keep the group relatively intimate so that we can have conversations about what is going on in everybody's practice. Now, the way that this program is set up is that there's a theme for every month. And the themes that we focus on setting a goal. So you will be invited to think about a leadership goal that you have for your practice. Then we move into self-concept, right? This is the idea. You as leader, what does that look like? What parts of yourself do you need to let go? And what are you moving into? We talk about obstacles. So I love obstacles. I think obstacles are your pathway to success when you can identify what it is that stands in your way, whether they are external obstacles or internal obstacles or both. Then you know exactly what you need to do to move forward. So an example of an external obstacle, maybe you're in an environment where you know that you don't have that opportunity for leadership. And so then that might be the external obstacle. The internal obstacle becomes, who do you need to be or become in order to deal with that external obstacle? So you can see how the two play with each other. And the more granular we get about the obstacles that we have, the more we learn about ourselves and the better able we are to move past them, move through them. We spend a month talking about confidence, authority, and power, which is probably my favorite month. This is where we bring the idea of leadership really into focus, right? Where, I mean, confidence is a topic that comes up so frequently in my practice, right? Where a lawyer wants to do something and they want to do it with confidence. So we practice, we think about what that looks like, and we get really granular about it. We talk about authority, right? This idea that you as an authority, who are you as an authority? How do you show up? What does that look like for you? And we talk about power, right? Again, I think for so many of us, power is something that we don't necessarily take for ourselves. We assume other people have it, we give it to other people. And so what happens when you focus on power and the power that you can exert, right? And I think sometimes we associate power as being something negative. And hopefully in that discussion about exerting influence, we just talked about this idea of the boats all rising with the tide. What great things can happen when you choose to exercise your power. We then move into boundaries. We spend a month talking about boundaries, what they are, and how to protect the things that are really important to you, which we have been, building on in the previous months. And then finally, we turn to sustainable growth, right? What does it take for you to keep growing? And we mentioned the idea of a set point a few minutes ago, right? That there may be a point where you grow and then it feels so uncomfortable, you kind of want to push yourself back. So how do you grow from there instead of doing something to bring yourself back to where it is that you're comfortable? Now, in addition to the monthly themes, we also have a couple of bonus calls, because what I find is that so many of my clients have questions about time management and transitions. So we spend an hour class talking about transitions, an hour class talking about time management, and I tailor the content to what is going on in the group. I mentioned I've had 3 different groups of women go through this program, and each group is different. And so I like to highlight issues that have come up in our discussions and focus on those. Finally, there is one-to-one coaching within the program. So for each of you, there would be 2 one-hour sessions with me to talk about your goal, to talk about anything that you'd like to talk about independently of the group. Now, I am a huge advocate and proponent of group coaching programs. I'm in many of them myself, and I have loved hosting them. I think there's a lot that we can learn from being in a container with others where we see that we're not the only one who has particular challenges. We learn from others in terms of how they manage what it is that they are dealing with. I think watching somebody else be coached is really powerful. When you are the one being coached, you have an experience of it, which is in itself valuable. But when you see it from the outside, you have that observer perspective, right? You're not necessarily tied into the details because it's somebody else speaking. And so that can be really powerful. One other thing I'll mention about the program is that it has been eligible. A very similar program has been eligible for 14 credits, both in Ontario and in BC. They were EDI credits in Ontario and I think practice management in BC. So I anticipate that there will be credits for this as well, and I'll confirm that, once I have it submitted and approved. But I anticipate that that would also be the case this time around. I will share a link to the program in an email. I'll send you a link with a recording of today's session, and I'll send you that information so that you have it. If you're interested, I'd love to hear from you. I think it's a really great program, especially if you're, a few years into your practice and you're thinking about, where you're going next in your career, what leadership looks like for you, how you want to lead. A number of the women in the programs have had children, all ages of ranges, all ranges of ages, from really, really new, going back to work after a mat leave, for example, to more senior. So maybe you've got grown up children and you're in your own practice. So I find that that's also a common thread among many of the women who have joined the program. So at that, I would love to hear if there are any questions or takeaways that you would like to share with me. We are very close to the top of the hour, and so I'm glad to see everybody will will have made their lunch in time. Um, some common questions that I have had in relation to the program itself is, how do I know that I would be a good fit for the program? I think you'd be a good fit for the program if this is something that appeals to you. If you're interested in personal development, professional development, that you want to do that in a container that's unique, where you're going to be in a group of like-minded women lawyers who are there because they want to support each other. They want a place to talk about some of the things that are on their mind. They want to share their experiences and have others who can share their experiences as well. It's great if you love the idea of having accountability. So I record all of the sessions. And so if you miss a session, that's fine. You can watch it on your own time. What I have found is that the more you're able to attend the sessions, the better. I see there's a question, the criteria for the selection of 8 people. Um, I typically hold the space open until there are 8 people who are in the program. And so um, the selection criteria so far has been that you are interested in the program and that you are practicing, you are a woman lawyer, and that this is something that resonates with you. I've had a number of lawyers who have joined that I've worked with already. So, we kind of know each other. I know what they're looking to accomplish. Some lawyers I've spoken with about the program in advance, and so we can confirm whether it's a good fit. So if you're curious or you have questions about it, you're welcome to reach out to me and we can have a separate call to talk about that. But typically those are the criteria, and I do limit the group at 8 lawyers. So those are some questions, like what is a good fit? What can I expect? I think if you're able to join the calls, that's ideal. They typically take place on the 2nd Wednesday and the 4th Wednesday of every month. So I think there's another. Is there another question? No, I think we've got the questions. If there's any other questions, please share them with me. If you have any comments, you're more than welcome to share. It has been a pleasure having you here today. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you have enjoyed today's session. I hope that you are able to apply some of these leadership skills as soon as possible, right? To really start noticing that dialogue you're having with yourself, to look for those opportunities to stand out, and to not hold back from bringing others into your vision and asking for the help that you need to be the leader that you want to be. So with that, I will thank you all for joining me here today. It has been wonderful having you with me. I'll just switch to the last slide. You'll find my email address there. You'll also see that there's a link to my podcast in case you want to check that out. Again, thank you so much for joining. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you for your thank you, Elena. And I hope to, I wish you all a good weekend and invite any questions that you have. So thank you so much, and bye for now.